I'm the CTO of Bluestream. We have a content management system called XDocs that we've been selling into the market for 15 years anyway. So we have obviously grappled with the localization process. We're kind of on our, fifth revision of that. And I just wanted to share some of the things that we've discovered along the way. And of course, we have to look at, when we look at these problems, we have to figure out how to put them into our system. So now I'm not really a localization expert. I don't speak 10 languages. Localization is bigger than just the the process of translating the words, but what I'm going to be focusing on is the process of translating the words, more or less, which I think people usually refer to as translation. Localization has to do with some larger issues to do with things like culturally appropriate colors and all kinds of different things. At any rate, let's see here. I've got, I'm going to go next. All right, so obviously we're in a world of cross-cultural trade. For example, Germany has a nice trade surplus there of $1.33 trillion. So as such, because we're trading, we're going to be localizing. So the unified language idea did not succeed. So here we have the general flow of localization, and it starts with some sort of content somewhere, and in this case in a content management system, you basically build or author the content, and then at some point you create a snapshot of that content, and you export that, and then you'll send that package to the LSP. The LSP will coordinate with their translators, and we'll also use something called a translation management system, which contains translation memory, and as such, it remembers translations that have been done, and we'll get into that. And the translators will typically use a translation workbench of some sort, which draws upon past translations where appropriate. And then a target package will be sent back, meaning the target language. So you send over English and you get back German. And then the CCMS will import those target files and will publish the target, and then you'll publish the target content, and then you iterate as necessary. Doesn't mean that all the files have to go over at once. You can actually, your source package could be half the files if you want to get started early, and such. There are slightly other ways that people have approached this problem, but I actually believe that this separation is the right separation, where the LSP, and you can have your own people be the LSP, but that the LSP uses a TMS, which maintains your translation memory over here. TMSs are fairly large, sophisticated programs. So you've got the translation team, you've got the content development team. You've got a localization manager who works along with the content development team. You've got a localization service provider, which is usually an external company, but can be a function within your company. Then you've got your translators. I always characterize the LSPs as sort of they're the people with the Rolodex that has all the contacts to the translators. And then you've got the in-country reviewer. And so the in-country reviewer is supposed to take the final result and review it. And then any changes actually have to go back to the LSP. So how those changes are communicated, there seems to be some variation in the industry. I'll get into that. So the core technologies of DITA, you know, our system is primarily a DITA CCMS. So the core technologies are, you've got XML and UTF-8. XML, of course, is extensible markup language, and UTF-8 is the usual way of encoding Unicode. Really, the big technology is Unicode, which allows you to express virtually any character in any language. That was a big problem in before the 90s, before the first Unicode conferences. People were encoding things in many different ways before Unicode. You've got standalone topics. You've got content references, you've got keys, conditional processing, the separation of content from presentation. You've got the XML lang decorations, which you know, can specify for an entire topic or a section of a topic what the language is that follows, you know, what language the content that follows that marking is. You can specify sections not to be translated, and then you've got the DITA supports the direction of writing, left to right or right to left, top to bottom. So you've got in the CCMS, you've got parallel of source and target files. So the CCMS will typically keep your English content, but it'll also keep your French, Japanese, German, you know, 45, 50 languages, however many you want. And it keeps them in parallel. There is a link. You do need to know that a particular target file, French, you know, changing the oil, to use the example, is linked to the English changing the oil, and that the French one in this case is target and the English is in fact source. It could be the other way around. You could have source French and target English, but knowing the two roles of the files is important. So the target version basically references the source version. There's three kinds of statuses that the target version can be in. Unlocalized, which means it's never been created. Old means that it was previously translated, but someone's gone in and changed the source, so the translation is actually now old. Current, that's great. Everything's up to date. Your French version matches your French version matches your English version. And then the CCMS, the other role that it has is it is used for the final publish. Now there is some variations to that I'm going to get into. I think the variation is that essentially for the final publish, the CCMS is used, but sometimes for intermediary publishes, we are seeing the LSPs are actually starting to do intermediary publishes, and there's problems with that, but there's also opportunities for further automation and time saving. So here's kind of a time-based understanding of the source and target. So at time 1, you've got this version 1 of oil.xml, and there is no corresponding French version. So therefore, the status is unlocalized. At time 2, it's still unlocalized, but then, sorry, at time 1.1, sorry, for this version 2. At time 2, you now have a French version. So it is now current. So in other words, this V1 of French oil matches and is linked to this V2 of English oil. And so at this time point, everybody's happy. You know, the French matches the English. Then of course, you know, the English version marches on, and the minute this V3 is created, then essentially the French becomes old. And so at this time, basically you've got this new English, you've got no corresponding French. The French corresponds to the earlier version, so therefore it's old at this time. Time 2 old, and then at time 4, you should probably say time 3 there. Anyway, at time 4, we've got current content again, because there's been a new translation that is matching the current head version. We call these the head, you know, the latest version is sometimes called the head version or the latest version. So if your latest version of French matches your latest version of English, then you are current. All right. So translation management system, what is that? The TMS. So the it's typically run by the LSP or people that understand, or you know, it could be run in-house as well, but it's run by people that understand you know, how to work the thing. You know, obviously people have to be trained. These are fairly significant pieces of software. Typically it will model the idea of customers, translation memories, and projects. The reasons it'll be customers is because the LSP typically will have, you know, may have 30 different companies that want their stuff translated. So, and then you'll have corresponding translation memories for that. Sometimes there's tweaking of this translation memories, so they can actually they can share translation memories across projects and so on and so forth. And then there's projects, and the projects concept, of course, is the soft concept, but often it's each job is a project in some TMSs. Other TMSs, it may be something different, but it's sort of, you know, has people, typically projects have people associated with them and some sort of objective. There's metrics and costing, so, you know, often you want to say, well, what does it take to translate this into Russian? I want a cost, you know, I want a price, I want a quote before I proceed. Maybe I'll decide not to do Russian this time. The metrics is, you know, you've given me a job, so many words, you know, and it goes into the costing and such. There'll typically, an online translation workbench is a good feature. So basically, it means your translators can be anywhere in the world. If they're connected to the internet, they can log on and do the translation. There are other more desktop translation workbenches as well. So if you want to, if you want to send XLIF to the translators, they can just work with these XLIF files locally, and they don't have to be connected to the internet. TMS should be able to import DITA as DITA and export DITA. Often it will support the import of XLIF and the export of XLIF. But the simplest model is that the CCMS sends the DITA over and the DITA comes back. Terminology management allows you to send terminology files that have particular translations. And then there's even federation, so that this is one of these things that happens for business reasons, is you might have one LSP is subcontracting a whole job to another LSP. And so, the federation allows one TMS to talk to another TMS. Translation memory essentially stores segment correspondence. Segment, what's meant by that is you'll have, a short phrase of English and a corresponding short segment of French that matches that. It's often a proprietary database, meaning, it may be a SQL database, but the actual model of the database is proprietary to the TMS, like what tables exist and what data is stored is proprietary. TMX, there is actually a standard form of translation memory called TMX, Translation Memory Exchange. And so often that's relevant. There's a whole issue called owning your TM, and anytime you enter into, if you're a content creator, basically, and you're documenting your product, and you're contracting to an LSP, it's good to be able to capture your translation memory. Or know that you own it or can get it at any time in case you want to change vendors or what have you, because you are actually investing in the translation memory is an asset, and it should be controlled by the content producing company. So here's an example of the open standard TMX, and you've essentially, again, got a segment correspondence. So it's I find that in the industry, when I went into this about when I started looking into localization functionality about probably 8 years ago or 10 years ago or whenever it was, there was a bit of mystery, and it seemed that at that time, because there was mystery, people were doing things, and it was expensive to do translation, and nobody really understood what was going on. So and there were a couple of approaches that were being used, and so I spent a bunch of time just thinking about what the best process should be, and part of that was modeling what happens inside the translation, the translation management system, the TMS. So this is not a perfect modeling, but if you are a localization manager in your organization, it does make sense to kind of understand what your LSP is doing for you and what their TMS is doing for them. So you take your source topic, comes from the CCMS, typically there will be an extract text form where it takes your DITA topic, takes all the text out of it, turns that into source segments, and saves away this thing called the skeleton file, which is basically all the XML tags without the text in it. So then it takes those source segments, does an analysis phase. It may match to the translation memory that exists, and the analysis phase will put out the matched segments. Then it's sent to translation. So there may be things already matched, or suggested, depending on whether it's an ICE match or a 100% match or less, a fuzzy match down to 75%. So that will suggest things to the translator. The translator will fill in the blanks of the untranslated segments, may override some of the translated ones. Then at this point, the translation memory has to be updated again with the hard work done by the translator. Then once that's done, the actual content, the segment translations go back here to build target topic. It says, oh, I got that skeleton file. And there's a correspondence between every segment and the skeleton file, like fill in the blanks again, please. Builds the topic in French, let's say. It came in as English, builds it in French down here, and basically produces the target topic, goes back to the CCMS. So that's the process there. That I imagine the TMS goes through. Now, I haven't written the TMS, but you will hear your LSP talk about the analysis phase. They may charge you for the analysis phase. They may make the analysis phase free. You know, as well, I didn't get into quoting here. That's another whole function. So the TMS analysis, you've got ICE matches, which are in context exact matches. In other words, the TMS has decided that it already has a translation for that phrase, and that phrase is preceded by the stuff, the content that it was previously preceded by. So it's very likely that the translation is accurate. So the ICE match is the very best match you can get. It's in context. 100% match means that there's a correspondence between the words coming in and a translation done in the past, and then you get fuzzy matches. Go down to 70%, and then there's no match. Here's an example skeleton file. You can see there's no text here. There's just %1%, which means, you know, this is a placeholder for segment 1. In the body, you've got some paragraph as placeholder for segment 2. XLIF files, you'll hear XLIF mentioned. It is an interchange for localization information. You may have nothing filled in down here. You can see that it references a skeleton file. In the past, people have actually passed XLIF files out of the CCMS. It is a way, if you maintained all the XLIF information, it is a way to own your translations. But there's a whole number of operational problems that occur if you start keeping track of the XLIF files in your CCMS. And because the CCMS doesn't have the translation memory, you're still going to have to go through that in a separate place, et cetera, et cetera. So that's why I recommend not storing XLIF files in the CCMS, rather just dealing with DITA out and DITA in. Requirements and solutions. So we've got basic flow, capture at release time, iterative, common content, manual fix-up, review translations, automation issues. So The basic flow is choose the topic set, one or n language that you want it, target languages you want it translated into, one or more LSPs. You might have some LSPs do Japanese and other LSPs do Russian, it depends. Well, it seems you'll let the LSP manage that in a lot of cases, as opposed to, you know, you managing the multiple LSPs. So you get LSP subcontracting. Export to LSP, you import and you publish. Simple flow. The capture is a particular situation where you've approved the content for release 1, the content's fully approved, the target content hasn't been translated yet, and the development of source content is continuing for a future 2.0 release. So the solutions in the case to accomplish the capture use case is you can branch the content at the time that you announce this release. The beauty of branching the content, if your CCMS supports branch, which of course XDocs does, is to, if you need to make changes, let's say your localization comes back and you actually have to change the source, then you can change it independently while you're continuing to develop the source content for 2.0. You can export the localization by label. That's not quite as powerful as branching, because if you need to make a change, labels don't typically allow you to go back and make a change. They're not as powerful as branches. So the release 1 content, if it has to change for any reason because of translation, you're in trouble there. You can also just make a copy of it in the CCMS. And also you want to make sure your branch system branches all the localizations. Otherwise, when you make the branch, everything will be marked as never translated. And I guess the other solution to a capture is hold the presses on version 2.0. Just basically stop the presses. So iterative translation is kind of another use case. 60% is pre-translated ahead of time, and then you have these sprints of translations that you translate a project multiple times. So because sometimes translation can hold up release of the product. So what you do to avoid that is you translate ahead of time, some portion that you finished of the content, and then basically send the rest out when you're ready. And so it'll be quicker turnaround by the LSP. Basic idea here is every topic has a certain time required to translate it. So common content is another use case. So you prevent retranslation of common content. In that case, you've got Project A and Project B. They share some common corporate content. We see a lot of reuse in DITA, so you do want to be able to handle reuse. You could have a separate project for the common content and send that out on its own for translation. You could just let the translation memory handle it. In other words, you send the common content out multiple times, but the translation memory remembers, hey, I saw this before, and it basically gives ice matches to the translator so they don't have to retranslate it. Again, there are costing issues associated with that. Your LSP might charge you, even though, for the analysis phase or something, right? So sometimes people refrain from, they might charge per topic even though it's the same topic. So let the old current CCMS status handle it. So in that particular case, if you send out project A and it contains the common content, it comes back. Basically, all the common content will be marked as current. When you go to send out project B, you know, a good system will say, hey, you already sent out this common content, it's current. So you don't have to send current things out, obviously. So the CCMS should, you know, handle, you know, this kind of approach. Of course, XDocs does. You watch concurrent translation. Basically, this is kind of a warning here, is having things out. If you send both of them out at once, if you send project A and project B, boom, boom, out. Well, nothing is current yet. They're both old. So you've got these two translations out at the same time with the same content. So you're going to basically, you know, probably pay 2 times on the analysis phase at least. And, you know, the translators will say, oh, wow, I just translated this. You know, so I'm not exactly sure how LSPs handle that when they get the same thing twice. They may just ask to be translated twice. They may be smart enough to, you know, send out the first thing to be translated, get it into the translation memory, and then when they send out, they do the analysis on the second project. They get the translation memory filling in the pieces, but all bets are off as to what they do there. They may do the analysis on all incoming projects, in which case the translation memory on both projects will say, hey, I've never heard of this stuff before. So it'll get sent out for translation twice. Manual fix-up. So the situation here is to incorporate some image files not translated by the LSP. So maybe people downstairs are, things are being translated. There's stickers that are getting translated and put on machine parts. It's a special process. You receive the images from some other department, not your localization service provider. How do you incorporate those into the translated content? So you can do a direct insertion of the French stickers into the CMS. And then basically the fix-up stage is important, because if you do a direct insertion, the CCMS doesn't know that it's associated with the English. So you essentially have to associate these French stickers with the outgoing English. So it's just it's kind of a shortcut on the more formalized LSP export-import process. Okay, so review translations. To ensure translations can be reviewed effectively, the translation team must ensure that translation makes sense. I'm missing a word there. Within cultural and technical context. So if it doesn't make sense, you know, how do you fix it? So the key point here is, okay, you've done all your translations, you're back on the CCMS, you run off the PDF, and you have an in-country review, and the in-country reviewer says there's 10 problems with this translation. You know, the translators didn't know your subject, you know, they don't understand robots, and they put in the wrong words. You know, let's say you make robots, and they put in the wrong words. This has to go back. It has to be retranslated. All you're looking at that point is a bunch of PDFs. So you have to get from the PDFs, you have to get into the source content. Well, there may be nothing wrong with the source. The English is great. It's just the French translation is broken. So, you know, in that case, it is hard to communicate that back to the LSP because it's not part of the standard procedure of localization where you send out source content. The source content hasn't changed. There's something wrong with the translation. So normally what's happened in the past is people have sent out marked up PDFs directly to the LSP, and then they've said, please, you know, restate these particular topics, and they may in the CCMS send the source content back out with the understanding that actually this, you know, it has not changed, but in doing that you trigger the ability to import new French, and so and you send the PDF along with it and say, come on, change these things. So that's quite expensive and disruptive, involves a lot of moving pieces. So one way to fix that is, because really you want to make the changes to the translation memory for the French correspondence to the English segments. You're not changing the English segments. So the better way to do it is to have the LSP do the in-country review and orchestrate that. So then when there's changes to the translations, they can incorporate it into the translation memory. So here's a tool by a particular LSP called WHP. And so what they're showing here is this. You can go into this tool and change the translation for the corresponding English. And when you change that, it goes into the LSP's translation memory. And then eventually when the reviewer is happy with the translation, at that point, it gets sent back to the CCMS for the final publish. So the reviewing stage actually happens and is hosted by the LSP. And here's another example of, you know, how to, the original translation was this, but the corrected translation is this. And then you save the changes. This is again in the LSP reviewing tool. You know, you're basically fixing the segments in the translation memory. So the automation issues is you know, we've finally come to sort of more the title of the talk, but you know, we sort of have to establish the lay of the land, and actually all those other aspects you could call automation, but it turns out that there's additional automation that you want to perform in the communication and flow to the LSP. So it's this automation, these automation issues deal with the handoff of the source content, the quotes that come back for how much it's going to cost, the receipt of target content between the two separate organizations, and how can this flow and communication be as smooth as possible. So that's what we're looking at in this automations discussion, is that handoff. Because whenever you have the handoff between two organizations, between the product company that's writing this content and the LSP, you've got, it's really the communication between two companies and communication between two computer systems, because the CCMS is essentially sending things that will eventually be consumed by the TMS. So here's a bit of a flow chart here. So you create a cycle. A cycle, this uses the XDocs terminology, but it's pretty general ideas. Is a cycle represents, in most cases, a package of source content. with a list of languages that you want it translated into. The simplest cycle is to just have one language, and it's better to actually, I think now it's better to break each language request into a separate cycle. In other words, you send out the English and you ask for French, send out the English and you ask for Russian. The reason it's good to separate them is the French might come back or the German might come back early, and the Russian takes forever. And so there's certain advantages in getting the French back early. You can proceed with the French, review, maybe even release the French product. But if you send them out together, then you're kind of waiting for them to come back together. Anyway, small point. So the cycle's created, let's say it sends out the English and then it asks for the French back. The cycle becomes exported. Do you want to quote? So in this case, you can use FTP as your file transfer. So the system does this automatically. So these arrows represent the system doing things automatically. It sends, if there's a quote requested, then you're waiting for quote. At this point, the CCMS is halted, it's waiting. The LSP uploads the quote becomes ready, the CCMS goes. Somebody has to review, a human being reviews the quote, essentially approves it or rejects it. If they approve it, the translation is marked as started. And at that point, the CCMS is waiting again. And then eventually the LSP uploads the translation. And at that point, the CCMS takes over, imports the, checks the content to see if it's complete. If it could be that the LSP sends you back 3 of the files and you send out, 1,000 files, or, they send back 999. So that's a simple case of not complete. You're missing files. So if it's not complete, what happens is the CCMS has to sit there and retry. And it also, while all this is going on, you also want a notification scheme where emails are being sent to necessary people. When one system's waiting for a quote, it needs to tell the LSP contact, hey, I'm waiting for a quote. So that's part of the automation. And down here where it's incomplete, you get a broadcast to an email list. You build an email list and it essentially says, hey, this job is not complete. It was missing this file, or so on. So at that point, the LSP, you can sit there and wait for the file, until the LSP uploads a proper file. So that's, you stay in import not complete. Then if it is complete, then do you need a final review? The reason this was necessary is, we were shutting things down when they became complete. And what happens is some of our customers said, well, hey, I want to have a look at what they sent, because it seems to require human inspection, not just machine inspection of counting files and so on, right? Might be garbage. So you can turn on a switch, obviously, in our product that allows you to review. And if that switch is turned on, then you go into this state and the user has to manually press close. If there's no review pending, then boom, we say import complete and we close the cycle. So that's kind of, I hope that gives an inkling of automation. you know, before we had this kind of automation, we essentially, and we still do support a manual export. So you manually export to network drive, you sit down, you type, you know, you send this somehow, maybe go to an LSP's portal and upload it, and you send them an email, and then, you know, you somehow keep track that they're out, you know, this is out there, and you know, you basically contact people and you say, have you got that translation? And the LSP maybe uploads it and sends you an email. So it's a much more manual kind of process. So this kind of automates it so that the system goes through these different states, and essentially if everything goes smoothly, you never you know, you only have to do something when it asks you to do something, and you can get reports on what's outstanding and what the current state of your jobs are. We found this very useful for some of our customers that are doing hundreds, you know, they're doing hundreds of cycles a month. So they've got a lot of products and a lot of languages. So it just became, you know, very stressful to not have it automated. So done yet? No, that's not talking about this talk. It's I am just about done, but no, it's talking about done yet is how do you know when the translation is done? And there's a couple of tricky twists. So determine that the documentation is done. Done means safely back in the CCMS and ready for publish. So project A is set up to document revision 1.1 of product Y in 5 languages. How do I know when project A is done in a concurrent translation environment with overlapping reuse? So sometimes, as we talked about earlier, it's hard to, it's nice to control overlapping reuse, but at some point, if you're in a complex environment, you just throw up your hands and you say, okay, the LSP will handle the overlapping reuse with the translation memory. So so in that case, you know, how do you know when something is done? Even in the case of overlapping reuse, where maybe one project sends out all the files and the second project doesn't send out all the files because there was, you know, reuse and something came back or what have you, right? So in that situation, you know, how do you avoid that? And actually, XDocs has a feature to avoid overlapping reuse, whereby if you send out the first project, if it's in revision, you know, XDocs will tell you, hey, you already sent these files out, so you have the choice to not send them out again. And so in that case, you get this dependence between the second project, which didn't send out all the files, because it knows that the first project did send out all the files. And it's a situation where there's common files. So, so what happens is you get this situation, well, how do I know if project B is done? Because I didn't send out all the files, because project A was going to translate those, but now all of a sudden project B comes back early because maybe it's an easy or smaller project or something, and it's missing a bunch of files that it depended on from project A. And so how do you model that and report it? And we call those blocked links. You know, how do you deal with that issue? And how do you automatically heal things when the blockers arrive? The blockers being project A, the reusable stuff, finally comes back. How do you release project B and put it in a doneness state? So there is some complexity there. So I think that's pretty well all that I was going to talk about. I think there's commercial considerations, you know, your cost per word and so on. I'm not going to get into that in much detail. I think you want to make sure that you own your TM. You don't need to own the TMS, but you can own the TM. You got to check your project management fees. Sometimes all you do is get an over project management fee, period, and then on top of that, your per word, which is a nice way to do business instead of having hidden costs by the LSP. It's nice to have a simple cost model. So you pay overhead, and then you pay per word. No cost on ice matches, no cost per TM analysis, no TM analysis cost. So I think in summary, all I wanted to say was, you know, there are well-known use cases in localization. There are well-known techniques. There needs to be, you know, you always need to keep in mind a proper factoring of the tools. The CCMS does its job. The LSP does its job. As we say, as we've seen, the reviewing has migrated from the CCMS over to the LSP, and that's an evolving sort of migration of function. There are well-known processes, and as much automation as you can get is useful, especially if you've got high volumes. And if you take all of that together, you end up with the best practice. And that concludes my talk.
Thank you, Jim. Appreciate it. Remember, folks, you can type in your questions in the question dialog box. There was a lot that Jim covered, so feel free to ask him questions. I do have a question for you. With your client base, how often do people shop around for LSPs, or do they find one and stick with it, or is there something that you should give them a year, you should give them, you know, 2 years before you start shopping around? Any thoughts there?
We have seen people investigate changing LSPs, and you know, our customers have changed LSPs. Typically, though, there's a cost associated with that. Now, what's happened is because, you know, XDocs, see, each CCMS will have its own package format. So you'll want to go to an LSP that can properly process your CCMS package format. So what we found is as we have more and more customers, we're dealing with more and more LSPs, so they understand our format. It's a fairly simple format. It's just a zip file, but so there's some investment you make in this relationship with the LSP. So you really, and it does take a while to get things running smoothly. It can take, you know, 3 or 4 months, and so you definitely need to give your LSP, you know, a chance to make things smoother. Now, obviously, there can be failures on other levels, but yeah, I think it's a fairly crucial relationship.
Yeah, that's what we thought. I just do want to do a shout out to WHP because you did mention them, and they will definitely be at the Journeys and DITA North America conference. They've been exhibiting and participating in CIDM events for a while. So, as well as, of course, Bluestream will be there as well, of course. So we have a couple questions coming in. What are your thoughts on translating graphics?
Well, translating graphics, I think the best practice is to use something like SVG and to take the text out. if you cannot do that, then that's a situation we're talking about. The manual fix-up is sometimes you will spin that off as an in-house process, or you will extract the text, have that translated, and then have your graphic designer, construct your raster image. But again, there's a number of recommendations. Getting the text out of the image, I think, is the first one. But if it has to be in the image, then yeah, you get the text translated by a translator, and then essentially you have to do your graphics work. And some of the LSPs will actually do this work for you, but sometimes you're sensitive about the particular image, what it looks like, and that comes from your art department or something in your own organization. So that's where we have the manual fix-up feature in XDocs, which allows you to circumvent the whole formalized LSP process.
Yeah. Yeah, and the person that asked those questions said, totally agree. We've been trying to get the words out of graphics, and we constantly hear that from speakers, that you need to get the words out of your graphics if you're going to be translating, for sure. So is there a sort of a checklist or what list of tools that you have to make sure an LSP has before you sign them up? I know you gave some good best practices here, but is there certain tools they need, or?
Well, I think it's, you want to, the usual, vendors sort of certification. You want to make sure that they've done the kind of work that the languages, they've done the languages that you need for target languages. They've done those before. They've dealt with DITA. Definitely make sure that they've dealt with DITA before, that they have the tool chain for taking DITA from you and giving you back DITA that works. We have seen in the past things coming back like XML, invalid XML comes back from vendors and in the past. Or you're talking to vendors that have never done DITA, and so there's obviously a big learning curve for them. Often the vendors are very ready to adapt to whatever your package format is, because they're used to having many different packet, types, formats of files and different kinds of packages thrown at them. So they typically have a capability to adapt, but you want to make sure again that they've done, packages that correspond to your the CCMS that you have. They've done that before, or that the CCMS you have has a very easy to understand package format, and that they can do it. And you have to negotiate, who's going to pay for that. I think in terms of tool sets, you do want to make sure that they have a TMS, and that in fact you can own the translation memory from that TMS. They can give you an export of the TMX file and from time to time, and that it's written into the contract. So I think those are some of the considerations, but definitely track record, I would say, is number one in your space and your format.